Let me make sure. Okay, so we are now recording. I want to welcome everyone. Just so you all know, I'm Kaleda Walling, and I'm the director of the Richmond Senior Center. And this is our Meet the Candidate Forum. This is our second to last candidate that we are meeting. So I get to welcome Marjan Philhour, and the way we've set it up is we're going to ask you, Marjan, to just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about why you're running and your qualifications, and then we'll take turns. We have some questions. We had a survey done, so we have some specific questions that our membership had raised, and then we'll also take questions from the audience. Sound
Okay.
good?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Great.
And then
So I'll
and
let
then
you
will
take.
Hellas be translating
So
some.
yeah, Hellas should be doing it live. So if
Okay.
folks want translation, need translation, Kano's going to let them know to press the button, and they will hear a muted version of the English and a live version of their
Oh,
language.
wonderful.
Yeah.
That's great.
So
Okay,
technology
wonderful.
is so great.
Well, thank you. Thank you for
All right.
having me. I know this is just such an important time in our country, in our state, and locally. And so I really appreciate your taking the time to sit with me and all the other candidates in the race. I always love in our local elections where there's so much civic engagement and lots of neighbors interested in making a difference. I really look forward to, no matter what happens in the election, we're all still living here. And I think there's a lot of positivity and a lot of heart in these elections, and everyone is really just invested in the neighborhood. So this is just a wonderful conversation and a wonderful opportunity. So a little bit about me. I was born in the Richmond. I grew up on the peninsula, and then, gosh, 14 years ago, my husband Byron and I decided to come back home and raise our family here. So we're raising our 3 kids here, and we are lucky enough that my mother-in-law lives with us. I grew up with my grandmother living with us, and so for me, and that was such a special thing for me growing up and for my brother. And we are, oh, so sorry, working from home and school at home, it's all just happening. So we moved back here because we love the Richmond. We love not just how beautiful it is and how wonderful the weather is, but we love the people who live in the Richmond, and we love the diversity of our neighborhoods. And I have over 30 years of experience in government and in business. My first political mentor was the late Congressman Tom Lantos. I spent many years working on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. I spent 3 years working for Governor Gray Davis through the energy crisis and until he was recalled, and then started my own business here in San Francisco, working for different candidates and nonprofits and organizations around community organizing and campaigns. I did run for supervisor 4 years ago, and it was a very different time to campaign compared to now. I would have loved to have been getting together in person, but given the times that we're living in and the times we're campaigning in, so much is now done remotely, by phone or by Zoom. And 2 years ago, actually, my sister and I started our own small business on Balboa Street. For many years, I was the president of the Balboa Village Merchants Association. I co-founded the organization to really build a sense of community, not just amongst our merchants, but with neighbors, like close by to the merchant corridor. And since then we've done many activities for the neighborhood, and then finally my sister and I were able to find a space that was accessible, right? I mean, I think it's just so hard to start a small business here in San Francisco. And, part of the point of the space was not just to have a little gift shop, but also a space for artists to get together, to practice their craft, but also to feature gifts from local artists. But, I think that in our city and in our neighborhood in particular, there's a lot of room for more collaboration in addressing so many of the challenges that we've seen here, especially through the pandemic. I think that ensuring that we're addressing homelessness, not just in our neighborhood, but citywide, and ensuring that we have services for those who are unhoused and are able to get them off their feet, but also preventing them from becoming homeless in the first place. And that means protecting rent control. It means that ensuring that we have more housing, more affordable housing and low-income housing that's affordable and accessible to our most vulnerable populations and also working families. I would like to see a neighborhood where we can see more small businesses thrive. Small businesses have been dying here in the city at the rate of 10% a month. Hopefully we're seeing that slow a little bit as we move through this pandemic. But really, supporting small businesses so that it is easier to stay in business, but also easier to start a business. And in particular, recruit business owners of color to kind of come to the Richmond and start their businesses here. I think that we need to do much more around housing accessibility and affordability, especially in the midst of this climate crisis, and look at where we can create homes for folks in transit corridors like Gary Boulevard. I mean, there's so much that can be done even within existing zoning that I think we need to explore. And I think that's also the environmentally responsible thing to do. And clean, safe streets. I think that there's some bread and butter issues that a supervisor can address to ensure that our streets are clean and safe, that we have enough garbage cans, that we're supporting merchants in keeping those streets clean. And that we're, of course, looking at, public safety. I think that public safety and police accountability are both core responsibilities of local government, and we can do both. We've seen a slight rise in crime during this pandemic, but I also think that it's not always necessary for someone with a badge and a gun to show up at the scene, and that's where we need to enlist more social workers as well as crisis intervention specialists. So all those things I think fall under the responsibility of a local supervisor. I do think that now more than ever, it's going to be very important for our supervisor to be proactive in working with all communities and all stakeholders and residents, frankly, because I think that one of the things I learned during my time in government has been just the importance of the work that we do every day as public servants being relevant to the constituencies that we serve. And so that means that we're not going to agree all the time, but that we do agree that we love our neighborhood and we want to move forward together, and that we're going to see those disagreements. I think that's part of a healthy public discourse. So, that's why I'm running, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Great, thank you. You actually touched on one of our first questions quite a bit. So I'm gonna, there was the talking about housing and homelessness. I'm gonna actually ask you to share with us your core values and a little bit about your beliefs and how you engage with others. How will you work with the folks at City Hall, specifically people that you may not agree with, and how would you approach that?
Yeah, I think that what this pandemic has shown, I mean, San Francisco is a very politically sophisticated town. It's been like that for a really long time. I think, we have a Speaker of the House who's from San Francisco and 2 US senators from San Francisco, as well as vice presidential nominee, and also our governor. I think that as we move forward and recover from this pandemic, I mean, in political campaigns, there are people who are with you and people who aren't with you. But after the election, we need to move forward together. And, I certainly don't take any of that personally. I think that, part of it is just the nature of campaigning. And I'm very open to working with our current leadership. Some support me and some don't, but that's okay. I mean, we're in the midst of a political campaign. But I think that it is incumbent upon us as as leaders and also prospective leaders for our city to really be committed to working together for the good of local residents. And so, I think, I witnessed at a young age, and also, my parents taught me. My parents immigrated here from Iran and the Philippines, and they immigrated to San Francisco for many reasons, because of that diversity, because of that inclusivity, because of the opportunity, and because they understood the importance of community. And so not just from my family, but from my early political and community organizing experiences, I learned the importance of government doing good things for people. And so, there are a lot of folks who may disagree with me, and there are a lot of folks who may agree with me. But at the end of the day, we really need to do what we are charged with as potential public servants, or, if I'm elected as a public servant, to ensure that our communities come first, and that, we're looking at, number one, protecting our most vulnerable. And when we look at our senior population, I mean, I live that every day, with my mother-in-law, who our family obviously is very close to, but, she's immunocompromised, and we look at things through that lens, how our home is set up, what's happening on the outside, what we can do so that, she's able to lead a life of dignity and also, happiness, right, and fulfillment as she moves through her years. And I think, that's something that would be a top priority for me as well, because, when we talk about our seniors, right, if it weren't for them, we wouldn't be here, right? And so I think we need to understand that and move forward in our policies and even in our community work with that in mind. So when, again, I would suspect we'll get to this a little later, but when we talk about, our housing policies and accessibility, and even seniors who are homeowners who have lived in their homes for decades, who need help with upgrades or repairs, right? I mean, that's something that needs to be part of how we look at how we're serving our communities.
Great. Thank you. I just want to check in and see if there's any questions from the attendees as well. I have a good list of questions that we culled from people through a survey, but I want to see if there's any follow-up questions. I also see that there's somebody who's joining us by phone at a 650 number, and I would love for you to say hello and who you are so I know the names of who's joining us. I'm going to unmute you. And all I have is the number 650 and then it ends in 609. So if that's your number and you want to say hello and introduce yourself, that would be great.
Can you hear me now, or am I muted?
I can hear you. We can hear you now.
This is Kevin Casey, a member of the Richmond Senior Center. Very
Hey,
interested
Kevin.
in what the candidates have to say. Yeah, I'm just listening in right now.
Hi.
Wonderful.
So thank you.
Great. I just renamed you so we all know it's you. Welcome, Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
If there's no one going to have a question, I'm going to follow up with because you touched a little bit on services, aging services, and the ability for seniors to age in community. And so can you talk to us a little bit about what your vision is for how citywide services could be improved, and how you might approach and support funding if you were elected?
So I think, I mean, that's there's a lot there. I mean, I think one of the things, I'm always learning as well. Like several years ago, gosh, it must have been in 2015, I worked closely in the initial stages with the Dignity Fund Coalition and met so many stakeholders who were very kind enough to share with me, their experience, right? Whether, they were veterans or working with our vulnerable communities or with our Chinese American community, about what seniors need. And I think, food insecurity and food access is critically important. We need to ensure that, whether it's a grocery delivery program or a meal delivery program, or, we aren't having, congregate meals, I guess, as much now, right, given where we are, but, ensuring that people are not, and our seniors especially, are not food insecure. I think that is number one. We need to ensure that there is funding for that. It needs to come from the city. I mean, I know that there are a lot of different areas, and especially now everybody's, donating food, but that's not always the case, right? And so we need to make sure that folks aren't going hungry. We need to ensure that folks are safe in their homes, right? And not in danger of becoming unhoused. And I think that, that means not just rent control, but also subsidies. That means, the rent moratoriums that are in place right now. We need to really support those things, right? Especially in the midst of this pandemic, because, the economic impacts of what we're seeing don't seem to be ending anytime soon. And then, there's the aspect of socialization, right? And ensuring that our seniors aren't isolated and that they're getting the support, the social and psychological support that they need, because it's, that human to human contact is so critically important. And now, even like the human touch, right? It's like that's not something, it's something that we took for granted for such a long time. And now it's become a whole public health issue. And, it's part of what gets us through life, and it's part of what builds that human connection. So I think that, ensuring that organizations in our communities are fully funded, or are those, for the programs that they're providing, that, seniors not only have the support on food, on shelter, on, connection, on activities, physical activities, especially, we talk, Zoom can only go so far, right? So I think that that needs to be at the top of our list when we look at, where do we actually need to put these funds that we have as a city, especially when we look at these budget cuts, that we must protect our senior population. And that means that prioritizing that funding, not just to support nonprofits and organizations that provide the services, but also direct services directly from the city. And, it all has to be culturally competent and in language and, relevant, to the seniors who are accepting the services.
Thank you. I'm gonna call on someone, Cheryl Marr. I know you're there, and I know you have really good questions, and so I'm gonna poke you a little bit and ask you if you have any follow-up questions or anything specific burning that you'd like to ask.
Sure, Marjan. I have a question that I've been asking folks, but what do you need to learn more about? And this can be in regards to politics, the issues, specific populations, but as it relates to your role as supervisor, what do you need to learn more about?
So, I think that especially in these times that we're living in, not just around the pandemic, but in these times of, extraordinary social justice and change, I've been very proud to work with Black leaders like Mayor London Breed and Board of Equalization member Malia Cohen and Kimberly Ellis and other Black residents. But I think that we, and I can speak for myself, can always do better at being an anti-racist ally and learning more about how we can support our Black and Brown communities, and how that intersects with our Richmond District community, our Chinese community here in the Richmond and in Chinatown, a huge part of the fabric and our culture. And I think we need to acknowledge that history and the present, right? Because it continues into today and it's so much of a part of who our residents are. But I think also looking at that intersectionality and how we can be partners, advocates, and anti-racist allies to our Black and Brown communities, and integrating that into our policies is something that I would very much look forward to growing more in professionally. I mean, I know where my heart is and I know what my experience has been, but I am open to the fact that I don't know everything and my life experience is different from others. And I'm very open to learning and also supporting in that way.
Cheryl, did you have any follow-up?
No, you can call on me later, but I'll let other folks go ahead.
Great. Well, there is a question that kind of comes from what you were just talking about. We in our district, there's a couple of groups that we're a part of, and there's lots of different organizations or coalitions. There's the Richmond Community Coalition. It's a group of CBOs that meets monthly, and actually quarterly, sorry. And then we're part of the Senior Roundtable that is senior serving CBOs that meets monthly. And it's really, there are opportunities for us to pull together and leverage our strengths, and also kind of find areas where we can together advocate for our needs to serve the community. So if you're elected District 1 supervisor, how do you see yourself engaging and supporting those groups? Will you attend the meetings or have staff that will attend? And just talk to us a little bit about how you might be involved.
Well, one of the things I tried or I endeavored to do in this campaign, especially because it
was cutting out for some reason.
I know I somehow muted, but now
okay,
can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So one of the things I've tried to do in this campaign, when we first started, our focus was on calling neighbors and ensuring that, they had food on the table, if they needed help getting groceries. I mean, at the time, you might recall, for so many still can't go to the grocery store, but I remember back in March and April going to the grocery store for neighbors, and many of them seniors. And it was a very stressful experience, right? We didn't know much about the virus, and you had a mask on, and it was like one way in the aisles. And I just, what I was trying to show was, yes, it is strange to run a political campaign in the midst of a pandemic and no one really knew what was coming next, but our focus needed to be supporting our community. Another thing that we have done during the course of this campaign is we hosted a neighborhood summit, and we put a call to action to neighbors and said, hey, we have these working groups, right, around transportation, housing, homelessness, public safety, the arts, education, right? And neighbors signed up to serve in these working groups. And we met over Zoom, and then, put some report together for a summit in September. And, of course, that's a very kind of truncated version of what it would be like to actually serve in office. But I think what I was trying to demonstrate was, we need all voices at the table, and we need to ensure that as public servants, that we're reaching out proactively and soliciting, right? Not just the input, but the disagreement, right? Like, what don't you agree with and why? And let's come to a workable solution. And so when you talk about the Richmond Community Coalition and other organizations, I think that, whether you meet quarterly or monthly, I mean, that communication with the supervisor's office needs to be a regular occurrence, right? I would say more than monthly, more than quarterly, so that, I think so many times when there are disagreements in our neighborhood, whether it's on policy or politics, I think communication can really solve that, right? Communication and really understanding folks' background, right? I think too many times we don't really get to know each other, and that, that lack of communication and that void can lead to some pretty serious misunderstandings. And so as supervisor, I 100% would be committed to engaging, not just myself, but also with staff, because that's the whole job of a supervisor, I think, to make sure that you're representing the community, advocating for what the community needs, but also showing leadership and, offering some sort of vision. Oh, I can't hear you.
Oops, because I hit mute instead of unmute.
Okay, just happened
You're not alone. If anyone else has any questions, this is your time to speak up. I'm gonna move on otherwise to another question that I'm interested in hearing your answer to, just because it's very current. I'm interested in hearing about your vision for our city and what it will look like in 2021 in response to COVID-19. How do you see things changing? What are we doing right now? What needs to change? What's not happening that should be happening? Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, I think that initially, I think the city did the right thing in shutting down early. I know that was, much to the consternation of many. It was a very different thing. And, culturally in our country, like, we're not used to, wearing masks when we're sick, right? And getting kind of ramping up to that culture shift, I think was something that we're, I hope, getting now. I mean, every once in a while you see folks not doing that. I do think that moving forward, especially with these budget cuts, we're going to need to see more collaboration on the Board of Supervisors to ensure that we're really looking at where that funding is going to come from to protect, our most vulnerable, including tenants, right? And that means looking at eviction moratoriums and expanding on those, because the pandemic is, when is it going to end? And then even like, with the vaccine, when is that going to happen, and are people going to take it, and that kind of thing. I think that we need to look at, from a small business standpoint, the city has already made things more flexible. There's a ballot measure on the ballot that will help with that, but also how we look at coming back together as a community. I think the shared spaces program is going to be critically important, and we're going to need to do more of that. And when we look at access to public spaces and coming to some sort of an agreement so that seniors and people with disabilities continue to have access to areas like Golden Gate Park, but also that we have more open spaces like the Slow Streets program, right, that make it safe, right, for people, whether you're in a bike, on a wheelchair, in a scooter, or just walking, right, to be kind of making your way around the city. I think right now, we're looking at different ideas around transportation, around, talking about like BRT and how to have minimal impact on businesses and ensuring that we're not eliminating stops, especially stops that, seniors need to get to the senior center or, whatever destination it is. But we're, I think, also looking at ideas that wouldn't, even though, BRT is on the books, like in this pandemic, looking at ideas to speed up bus service, right? So that, in absence of that infrastructure where we're still continuing to serve our most vulnerable populations with innovative transportation service. Additionally, I think we do need to ensure that we're continuing to provide PPE, not just to our most vulnerable populations, but to our teachers, our nurses, our frontline workers, firefighters. I mean, there is a shortage and that needs to be in the budget. Not everybody can afford that. And I think in order to keep our residents safe, we can't assume that everyone is going to be able to have access to these protective measures. But I think ultimately that does require a collaboration. And I think, what we're looking at right now on the current Board of Supervisors, and, I don't think it's a lost cause. I think it just requires one or two people to say, hey, let's really come together to make some of these changes so that we can protect those who are at risk of losing their homes. We can protect renters who are at risk of being evicted so that they're not evicted. We can make these moratoriums stronger. We can, protect the people who have lost their incomes, right? Thousands of Richmond residents have applied for unemployment and then have stopped receiving those checks. We can look at, there was recently an announcement today around Jobs Now, around how the city can increase funding so that it provides jobs to local residents so that they can be hired by local businesses. And that includes seniors who are interested, right? I think seniors have so much to offer, not just in the wealth of knowledge and experience, but also in the skills that I think sometimes is overlooked. And I think that's what we need to look at as as we move into 2021.
Great, thank you. Kana, you have any questions that you'd like to ask?
Hi.
Hi, Marjan. What's the first thing if you become our supervisor? Like, what's the first thing you are going to do?
Well, I think there are several urgent matters facing our neighborhood. I think addressing homelessness would be number one on the list, all those aspects, right? There isn't one simple solution. I think, looking at mental health and how we can support those who have mental health challenges. I think looking at substance use disorder and how we can really get folks on the road to recovery. Again, ensuring that people aren't getting evicted in the first place. I think a supervisor can really take a hands-on approach to those challenges. Additionally, from an administrative standpoint, I would love to set up working groups in several issue areas for neighbors to get involved. And that does include seniors. It does include our Chinese community. It includes our Filipino American community, which there is one in the Richmond, and it means having those proactive conversations. And, I think that it is incumbent upon the new supervisor to ensure that everybody, no matter background, political persuasion, whether or not they were a supporter in the race, that they feel included, because I think that that's something that we're going to need as we move forward, especially in the recovery. Oh,
I'm muted again. I'm going back and forth. I wanted to ask about homelessness and your approach or your thoughts on homelessness. We have a lot of seniors who are afraid of or dealing with homelessness. And I actually had some very frustrating experiences trying to get some folks who were unhoused into some housing right at the start of the pandemic. And the hardest part was sort of the bureaucracy. Like there were so many hoops to jump through, and there were so many barriers that she had, with her mental health, with her physical health, with being tired and, not well fed. Like she had so many things going on. The challenge of just getting the help that she needed. What are your thoughts, or what are your solutions to making that an easier process?
Well, unfortunately, I share your experience. I think we can do better to support our unhoused residents. I think we need to ensure that, number one, they're getting the help that they need on the street, but also that they're not faced with having to live on the street. And that means more shelter beds. It means more mental health beds. It means substance use disorder treatment. It also means ensuring that when you have the support, like it's not police officers going out there and working with our unhoused population. We need social workers who have the experience. We need crisis intervention specialists. Like there was a time, I actually went on a ride along with a couple of officers some years ago, and this gentleman was having a mental break on Muni, right? And I don't believe that police officers are necessarily the people to deal with someone who is, having disrobing on Muni and clearly needing support, right? I do think that we need to ensure that, people aren't starving in our streets, and that our nonprofits are able to provide, nonprofits and other community organizations can support them and provide meals. But at the same time, there was actually a gentleman who was living out of his car on Clement and 11th, and several neighbors had spoken to him. I actually had a conversation, he was an older gentleman, like mid-70s, and was afraid to move into a shelter. And that shouldn't be the case. Our shelters shouldn't be a place where people are afraid to go. They should be a place where people can find support and also transition onto their own 2 feet and get that kind of support from our city, and then eventually live independently. So I think that leading with compassion around the issue of homelessness, but also understanding that, with organizations that provide services that, we're very transparent in how those services are provided, so we can actually see a difference on our streets. Because I think so many of the root causes, whether it's substance use disorder or mental health challenges, or being housing insecure and it just becoming too much and the right protections weren't in place, there isn't one simple solution, but I think it is a day-to-day thing. And I do think that a supervisor's office can address that challenge every day. And working with different departments and really acting as an advocate, right, so that people can get those services.
Great, thank you. Kevin, I'm going to pick on you. You've been listening. Do you have any? What's a burning question you might have, or a priority that you have for the new supervisor?
Well, I'd be interested in Marjan's position on getting the kids back to school as soon as possible.
Yeah, I think that that needs to be a top priority, or the top priority, keeping our kids and our teachers and our paraprofessionals safe. I think that goes, we need to look at working, whether it's with DPH or other health professionals, on what our schools will need to make the classroom safe. I mean, people are talking about, putting plastic around desks and having like UV energy so that, if the virus is in the air, that they're able to kind of clear the air that way. But I think ultimately we need to make sure that, one, our kids are safe, but also just as importantly that, our teachers are safe, right? Because they're going to be in the classroom and meeting with several cohorts of students. Given where we are, as a city, I mean, I think that does require, one, more PPE. And, I will certainly speak out that this should be a top priority, but also that our Board of Education makes that also a top priority, because I think, kids want to go back to school. I think a lot of teachers also want to go back to school, but everybody wants to feel safe. And so what the city can do is provide the resource, what the city can do, right? I mean, a lot of this is under the purview of the school board, but, with 3 kids, I talk to a lot of parents myself. And so, parents, kids, teachers, everyone wants to be back in school. And so I think that needs to be, that conversation needs to be driven pretty proactively. I think that SFUSD did a good job around ensuring, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, around ensuring, meals for our families who were most in need, that nobody was going hungry, and that, kids were getting computers and access to internet, but I think, we can continue to improve on that. But I do think, kids need to be back in school, and it becomes an equity issue because, other schools are slowly opening up. And I think our, Black and brown communities and kids in our Black and brown communities need to have the same access. And if we as a city aren't prioritizing that, we are being inequitable in that area.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I have a question. I was actually talking earlier with Kana. We were talking about one of the folks that we serve was going to get a flu shot, and it was really a challenge because this is more about transportation. She had to walk and go to a location that was very inaccessible, and she chose to walk because she didn't feel safe on public transit due to COVID. And so I'm just curious what you mentioned transportation. What are your thoughts on making it more accessible and safe for seniors, especially given the current situation?
Yeah, well, I think that's going to be a huge endeavor. I mean, when you talk about getting tested, whether it's a COVID test or a flu shot or eventually a COVID vaccine, I do think that as a city, we need to look into, and I think for this scenario that you address might not necessarily have been the case, but when we talk to home healthcare workers and also seniors who are homebound, like my mother-in-law is in a wheelchair, right? So she is homebound and she's on oxygen 24 hours a day. So it's a lot of that has to come to our home, right? And I think we need to look into how we can actually deliver those services. This is a life or death situation. And, in the past, that may not have been the case, flu shot delivery, right? But I think that's something that we should look at. And also COVID testing, how we're able to administer tests at home and protect seniors and their caregivers. But, on the public transportation aspect, I mean, that's, when you're talking about a large bus, right? I do think that we need to utilize our smaller fleet, MTA's smaller fleet, and have dedicated transportation for seniors. Just because we're going to see, especially seniors who aren't 100% independent and have some care, but want to be able to go and get their own tests. I do think that needs to be a priority. And I understand, we have those resources. We just need to activate them because, this isn't, especially I would imagine over the next year and absent of a coronavirus vaccine, we're still going to be facing this. And, there are the immediate short-term solutions, but also the longer-term solutions around improving transportation and making, bus stops more accessible so seniors don't have to walk for miles just to do something that's in, the best interests of their overall health. So I think we need to look at innovative ideas that will support not just our seniors, but our vulnerable populations in the neighborhood.
Thank you. I think, do we have, Winston, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to nudge Joey to ask it. This is something a couple of our staff have been talking about, but I don't know if you're familiar on WeChat. Very recently, Ellen Lee Zhou has been spreading this like apocalypse scenario for after November 3rd, if Trump wins, and telling a bunch of the seniors on WeChat, you should pack food for 2 months. There are going to be riots and such and such. And I wonder, addressing issues like this is going, especially with folks who are often fear-mongering, like she can sometimes be. How would you respond both as a message and via what platforms to sort of address that?
So that people feel safe? I mean, I think so. I think what you're saying, well, first of all, that is totally irresponsible and I think inhumane, right? To kind of threaten folks with the possibility of no food and, around this election. I think that our city has strong enough leadership to send that message to our communities that it's going to be okay here. I know that question has been asked of many elected leaders. I think I have mean, part of this is just engendering trust in government, right? Which has totally deteriorated at a national level. But I think there is no place for that kind of messaging. It is not responsible. It actually is preying upon our most vulnerable in our communities. And, you know, for city leaders, like from a city perspective, I think that, you know, whether it's Department of Elections or SFPD or, you know, supervisor's office or mayor's office, you know, to be able to be united in how we communicate that we are safe here in this city, your vote will be counted, that there are mechanisms in place should there be any type of civil unrest. But of course, peaceful protest is something that we support, right? But I think that it would require, I guess, one, social media communication, but you know, part of the challenge is when you approach the election. I mean, Facebook has suspended political ads, right, in the period leading up to election day and after election day, right, to kind of stymie that spread of misinformation. So I think that that's where our community groups come in, and partnering with our local elected officials and community leaders to make sure that the word is going out, not just on social media platforms, but also through other channels, right? Whether it's by phone or by text or at community hubs. I know we're not really outside a lot, but you know, people are still going to the grocery store, right? That's an essential business. And I think, you know, having a united front and working with community groups to make sure we're communicating through a trustworthy source is going to be critically important to ensure that, you know, our seniors and general population aren't burdened with this anxiety that is not a fair representation, right? Of you know, I can't predict what is going to happen, but I do have confidence and trust in our city government. I've heard this being addressed, and I think, you know, communicating this in language, right, so that people can understand, right, to really counter this misinformation. I mean, it's unfortunate. I mean, social media has brought us together in so many ways, but I think that this is one of the things that is not helpful or healthy for our communities.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
One thing that I've noticed, and through this whole pandemic, and we closed down and we were trying to reopen for some services, ADRC. So we have Aging and Disability Resource Center services that connect seniors with the different city programs and types of services. And it's needed still. We have a lot of folks who can join by Zoom and can get services over the phone, but there's still a lot of people who need that, you know, face-to-face time. They want to bring letters in that they need translated. And so space is a huge issue for us. We're on the 3rd floor of a building that has a tiny elevator. So, you know, if we were to open up, you know, and have limited numbers of people, it'd be like, you know, one person going up the elevator and having their meeting and then going back down the elevator, you know, just so ground floor space
Mhm.
for nonprofits that are small like us, but have a very, you know, and a very important role to play. What is your take or you know,
Yeah,
vision for helping nonprofits like us
yeah.
secure better space to do
Yeah,
service?
well, you know, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's if you can only see one person and it's a painstaking process for them and for you, and there are people waiting, I mean, it just becomes a psychological burden, right? And also physically prohibitive. I think that we need to be looking at, I mean, there are a lot of empty storefronts out there, and, you know, sometimes we don't know what's happening with them. And I think that, you know, a supervisor can work with the city and also understanding who owns these spaces. I mean, there are spaces that have been empty for many, many years in our community. And I think especially now when space is a matter of public health, a supervisor can help look into what is available, especially on the ground floor, and especially making it accessible, because you know, we are going to need that collectively as a community and as organizations that support our most vulnerable in the community. It really is a public health matter. And so I think that looking at those, there are plenty of empty storefronts. I think, you know, just as we're getting creative with what businesses can do in those spaces, you know, and also using outdoor spaces, why not look at some of those empty storefronts, make more flexible what those spaces are able to be used for, and utilize the outdoor space like the restaurants are doing, right? I think we really need to think outside the box moving forward so that we can continue to provide service and value and also support our organizations that do that.
Great, thank you. I'm going to do one more check-in with the folks. If there's any questions out there, I also want to be mindful of the time. So if there's no other questions, I'm going to see if anyone unmutes themselves and wants to ask.
I have a question.
Thank you.
Hi, Cheryl.
Hi. So how is community relations in the Richmond District? Is there inclusion and understanding, mutual respect? And if there's improvement to be made, how would you foster that?
So I think, one of the things that, comes out sometimes in campaigns is things become, I think, unfortunately, black and white. And there's, especially now that we're in, this pandemic, because there's so little room for like you can tell a lot in person. You can tell, from someone's body language, you can tell from, if you want to call it a vibe or some sort of feeling, right, that someone has in person. We don't have a lot of that. I do think there's a lot of wonderful, community, both support and goodwill in the Richmond. I think sometimes when you come around election years, well, not sometimes, it happens a lot, right? It heightens our differences more than what we have in common. And I think one thing that a supervisor can do, not just a supervisor, so many of our local leaders, is really just to put a stop to it, right? But, a week from election day, I don't know that that's going to happen, but I do think that, no matter what happens, at least for me, I mean, I'm living here, I'm raising my kids here, I intend to be here for a long time. That's why I want my kids to be able to come here and live here as well and raise their families here. And I think, part of that, having such a diverse field of candidates that also all seem to be committed and, connected to our community. At one point, it just needs to stop, right? And we need to come together and work together despite our differences. But, on top of all that, I think there's a lot of community goodwill in the Richmond District. I think that's why so many people gravitate towards the Richmond, and why, we have been able to make our home here and, have my kids have great friends. We're friends with a lot of families. We're friends with people from different, backgrounds and age ranges. And it's really just a wonderful place to live. But again, going back to the question previously around what I would like to learn and do better, I think that's a place where we can all grow and do better, is to really kind of put aside, see what we have in common and work on that, and then understand that our differences aren't personal and really do something, productive for our communities. But in general, I think the Richmond is a wonderful, friendly, welcoming place, but we can always do better.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
So I want to just in closing ask if you have just can take some time and just share anything that we didn't cover. We asked a lot of different questions and bounced around quite a bit, but is there anything that you want to share with us that we didn't get to go in depth on? And if not, just summarize your last
Oh,
thoughts.
well, thank you. No, I mean, I really appreciate this conversation. I think that it's the kind of thing that we all benefit from, and, your interest and, the interests of seniors in, what's happening, not just here in the Richmond, but how it's impacting, the city and vice versa. So, for me, I just, as I said, really love our neighborhood, raising my 3 kids here. I think that it's a place that can continue to be inclusive, and that as we move through this pandemic, we really need to not only get creative, but ensure that we're proactively being more inclusive and understanding where there are gaps, because, government and politics kind of go hand in hand, but I think now we really need to focus on the governance and the services as we move forward, because, we're facing a time that so many of us haven't experienced before, and we need some real hands-on leadership, not just from our supervisor, but also engagement, right, from neighbors who can support neighbors. So no matter what happens in this race, I'm really looking forward to being a part of that.
Great. Well, thank you. And thanks everyone for attending. Get out and vote if you haven't already. And we've recorded this, so it'll be uploaded and we'll share that with you. It'll be to our YouTube page. So anyone who wants. And with that, I thank you and have a good evening to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Okay, bye.
Bye now.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.